Good evening and welcome to this very special edition of the India and World series. We at Carnegie India gave a lot of thought to whether or not this is an appropriate time to host this particular conversation for many, especially within India and those far away with families and friends in India. This is a trying, heart wrenching, and even an impossible time. Yet, perhaps it is in these times that the world of history can take us away, even for an hour, from the immediate. It is in this spirit that we host today a book talk on and around Vijay Gokhale's magnificent, easy to read, and suitably challenging account of the events that led up to and those that occurred at Tiananmen Square in the summer of 1989. Mr. Gokhale was then a young diplomat, or I should say a younger diplomat, who had been in the Indian Foreign Service for less than a decade. He was based in Beijing and was a witness to the drama that unfolded. He got out of the wire, as it were, and mingled with students and protesters on the testing days in May and then June of 1989. All this as the Indian embassy in Beijing prepared for a new era of India's diplomatic relations with China, a process that was provided with a spark for change following Rajiv Gandhi's historic visit to China in December 1988. His new book, Tiananmen Square, The Making of a Protest, A Diplomat Looks Back, brings a unique perspective on a crucial event in China's history that successive Chinese leaders have tried hard to erase from public and international imagination. It also challenges many prevailing accounts of the crises, as well as those penned by American, British, and other diplomats and journalists, many of whom served in Beijing at the time. To discuss this tremendous book, we have with us the author, Vijay Gokhale. We're also privileged to have with us Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, who would have been Mr. Gokhale's boss or the number two at the embassy in 1989 in Beijing. We're also joined by Tanvi Madan, whose historical accounts of how China has shaped India's relations with the US introduces yet another lens to what transpired in 1989. By way of very brief introductions, Vijay Gokhale is a non-resident senior fellow at Carnegie India. Mr. Gokhale retired from the Indian Foreign Service in January 2020 after a diplomatic career that spanned 39 years. From January 2018 to 2020, he served as the Foreign Secretary of India. Prior to his term as Foreign Secretary, Mr. Gokhale had served as India's High Commissioner to Malaysia, as Ambassador of India to Germany, and pertinently for this discussion, as the Ambassador of India to the People's Republic of China between 2016 and 17. He's also served as head of the India-Taipei Association in Taiwan. During his time at the headquarters of the Ministry of External Affairs, he worked in key positions in the East India Division, including as Joint Secretary for East Asia. He is currently also a distinguished visiting faculty at the Rashtriya Raksha University in Gujarat. Shivshankar Menon is a distinguished fellow at CSEP and a visiting professor of international relations at Ashoka University. Ambassador Menon has served as the National Security Advisor to the Indian Prime Minister. He is the author of Choices Inside the Making of Indian Foreign Policy, published by the Brookings Press and Penguin in India. His new book, India and Asian Geopolitics, The Past Present, was released in May 2021, which we're very privileged to host him and a discussion around the book sometime in June. So we do look forward to that. Ambassador Menon has served as India's Foreign Secretary, Ambassador and High Commissioner to Israel, Sri Lanka, China, and Pakistan. Tanvi Madan is a senior fellow in the Project on International Order and Strategy in the Foreign Policy Program and director of the India Project at the Brookings Institution in Washington. Tanvi's own work explores the role of India in the world, its foreign policy, and it focuses particularly on India's relations with and between China and the United States. I think it is more than fair to say that Tanvi is one of the best known voices on Indian foreign and security policy. She's the author of the incredible book, Fateful Triangle. As you can see, we have a number of books over here. How China Shaped US-India Relations During the Cold War, published by Brookings last year. She's currently completing a monograph on India's foreign policy of diversification and doing a book also on another version of the China-India-US triangle. Very short housekeeping points before we get started. We have a number of people who've logged on for the call. We have people who are watching this on Twitter, on YouTube. If you have any questions on the Zoom call, please put it in the chat box. On the other platforms, please add your questions and they'll be relayed to me and I'll bring them back to the panelists. So with that, let me start, and perhaps if I can turn to Ambassador Gokhale first with a simple, straightforward question, sir. What prompted you to write this book and now?
Yeah, thank you, Rudro, and thank you, Carnegie India, for hosting this event. As you said, at a difficult and trying time for all of us in India. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank HarperCollins and the publisher, Prashant Chopra, for having faith in publishing this book. And finally to Mr. Menon and to Tanvi Madan for joining into this discussion. Obviously, Rudro, the first reason was because I was an eyewitness to some of the events that transpired in 1989, and I have had the benefit of hindsight. But very early on, the question that bothered me was, should we accept the Western presumption that this was a democratic upsurge in the Chinese people, their desire to be free of the Communist Party? Or do we take the official Chinese version to be the accurate one, which is that a handful of people, what they used to call black hands, were out to subvert and overthrow the Communist Party in China? Or was it something different from these two versions? And so that was the first reason why I began to explore the subject and wanted to write the book. Secondly, I felt this was a good time to write it because although the main players have all passed on, in a sense they've exited the stage, but the play continues to run in the theater. The Communist Party of China continues to be the ruling party in China, and it is becoming more powerful and it is becoming more entrenched day by day. And so I felt while the incident itself might be history, the relevance of this particular incident is very contemporary. After all, we need to understand what the Communist Party of China is all about. And of course, the final reason I wrote this was because this is something that an issue which many of us who in the foreign ministry have dealt with China have often spoken about, and that is the paucity of literature written by Indians for Indians on China. The go-to literature is either Western or increasingly Chinese. And so I felt that this was an important point in China's history and I should write this book. Now, originally, of course, because I had lots of notes and memories, my original intention was to write only about those 50 odd days. But subsequently, I decided that it is better to situate it in the context of the decade of the 1980s. Because to my mind, that was the decade when China came out of the chaos of the Cultural Revolution. And by the end of that decade, by 1990, China was pretty much on the path to reform and opening up, which has resulted in China becoming what it is today. So I thought that if I put the issue in that context, it would also give a broader understanding of China. And so my story is actually at many levels. At one level, it is how a state balanced the politics and the economics while opening up. How much of opening up could it permit before the stability of the country and the existence of the party began to come into question? So in that sense, it was at one level an issue of balance. At another level, it is the story, at least as far as I'm concerned, of Deng Xiaoping, of a man who perhaps I would consider the genius behind the rise of China. Somebody who displayed courage of conviction and great leadership, even abandoning two of his chosen successors, but keeping China very firmly on the path of economic reform. And how he was able to do so when there were problems within the party, challenges to him, ideological, political, and so on. So, in a sense, it is the story of Deng Xiaoping. And lastly, of course, it is the story of public expectations, which arise when you open up, and how a government handles those public expectations in a situation where fast or rapid change is taking place. And that was where the students came in. So all these stories I thought were important for Indians to read about. So this is my version of what happened, or what I think happened in Tiananmen, and that's why I wrote the book.
So if I could come back, and I'll come back to the point. I mean, the book really sets it up, perfectly, if you like, for anyone who's coming into Tiananmen. You've got the actors that you introduce with such eloquence. You've got the structure of China that you introduce. the modernization period, then Tiananmen and after. And perhaps the one part I'll come back to is on your somewhat scathing criticism of Western press and even Western diplomats, which is peppered in different parts of the book. But before I do that, can I just take you back to those testing days of May and June of 1989? You were out in the square, I can assume with some of your colleagues, as Gorbachev was coming into town for a major summit. At a time in which the square was full of hundreds of thousands of people. You yourself write about how 1.5 million people turned up 2 days after Gorbachev left. Just give us a sense of, as a young diplomat posted in an embassy in Beijing, which in itself must have been quite daunting in those days. Just give us a sense of, what did you see and how did you kind of read it at the time?
Well, for us, at least the younger diplomats in the embassy, this was our first real introduction to China as such, because China itself was a relatively closed country, and at that time, when there was no internet and there was no mobile phone and so on, the ability to interact with Chinese was limited. So to that extent, this was the first real exposure we had to China. And we were fortunate in having in the embassy Ambassador Ranganathan, Mr. Menon, who was the Deputy Chief of Mission, and Mr. Jaidev Ranade, who was the Senior Intelligence Officer. All of them had either dealt with China or served in China earlier. So in a sense, we had a very clear sort of guidance from the top, as it were. Because some of them had served in China during the Cultural Revolution or were working in Delhi at that time. So they knew how the system worked. And therefore, I feel that we had a sort of inside track into making sense of this. So when we used to go to the square, I probably think we asked a different set of questions to the people there, whether they were students, whether they were labor leaders, whether they were foreign journalists, than others did, others who had not experienced China before. And I would hazard the guess that perhaps among the foreign missions in Beijing, the Indian embassy was probably among the better informed. The points I bring out in the book was actually, in a sense, the assessment of the embassy at that time. Because we used to meet every morning in Mr. Menon's room to discuss all the newspapers. Mr. Menon was a very hard taskmaster. He would allot each of us 3 Chinese newspapers. We had better read it before we came into his room because he expected us to tell him what was on the headlines and what was inside the newspaper. And then we'd all go to Ambassador Ranganathan's room and discuss the street gossip. But that sort of exercise led to some sort of a rigor in analysis. So I would say that it was a very exciting time for us and a great education in China watching.
That kind of puts it in context for yourself, because I just want to quote for the audience. There are, in one particular place, you say that it is not always possible to get accurate information in a crisis, but US diplomats abandoned even the normal caution that should have been adopted when reporting back to headquarters. You also quote people like Ambassador Alan Donnell, the British ambassador at the time, who claimed that there were 10,000 fatalities, machine gun fire, etc. And it makes a lot of sense to say, that there were people, as you say, within the embassy who had the kind of background, the experience. But at the time, if I could just push you on this point, I mean, I'm assuming that a lot of these diplomats, for instance, were also pushed by emotion, by the excitement on the street, by a particular zeal. But is it really the structure of the embassy and the people who were there at the time that allowed you to take a somewhat more conservative or a somewhat more balanced kind of position with regards to China? Or was there something that others were missing? And I remember a conversation that Ambassador Menon had with Shekhar Gupta 3 years ago, where I think Shekhar started with the question of that he had gone out to Beijing as one of the, perhaps the only journalist or one of the two to cover it. And Ambassador Menon said that, don't get swayed by what you're hearing on the streets. In 2 or 3 days, this is going to be over, and take all the photographs that you want right now. So what is it that gave you that sense of balance and kind of a steady approach, if you like?
Well, my sense was that, the Western diplomats, I think, were swayed by ideology. This was the Cold War. And, today it's a very different situation in which we see international relations. But at that time, you were on one or the other side of the ideological divide. To that extent, we had the benefit that India was not in that sense on either side of it, in ideological terms. So we could look at China differently. We had in the embassy, the majority of officers spoke Chinese. I had some background in China, so there was a degree of expertise across the board, or 13 or 14 of us all to that extent had some of the other expertise on China. And thirdly, we did go out very often to talk to people in the square or in the universities and so on, which I suspect some of the other embassies did not. They chose to rely on second-hand sources like Western media. So I think that made the difference. So far as Western media was concerned, I do concede I have been a little critical, but that too has a certain personal background. I was in university when the emergency was declared in India. And we were brought up to believe that Indian media was not giving the right information and that the BBC was the go-to source for information. Now, of course, when I went to China and saw what happened in Tiananmen Square, in a sense, it revealed something different about the BBC and about the CNN and so on. It didn't appear to me that they were making reports based on objective facts always. And therefore, I was a little critical because to me, it sort of brought home the fact that there is no truly free media, if you know what I mean. I'm not saying, therefore, that the Western media was as controlled as the Soviet media, but I don't think the Western media is or was free in that classical sense either. But that's just my view.
No, thank you. And I'll just stop with this one. There's one of the most powerful two words in your book is where, in quote unquote, is where you say no massacre, which obviously flies in the face of a lot of the other literature, especially the kind of more cultural and people's literature here. I'm thinking of people like Louisa Lim and others. And there's obviously a kind of a numbers game associated to Tiananmen in a sense, and I can only assume is that as this book gets its critiques from various publishing houses in different parts of the world, this is the one thing that's going to be the kind of central point of discussion. But if I can segue to Ambassador Menon, perhaps I can just ask you, sir, for just some of your kind of opening thoughts and remarks before I can come back to you with a question or two.
Well, I think, like you said, this is a wonderful book because not only is it precise, detailed, an eyewitness account, but it's also analytical. And that, I think, is the strength of this book. And it's analytical from what I consider an objective point of view. Other people might say this is an Indian point of view. But the fact is, we didn't have a dog in this fight. We didn't think we had a dog in the fight. Our dog was dead. Well, Hu Yaopang was gone already, the one who had been reaching out to the Tibetans, who had been much more positive about India-China relations. But we had just gone through the Rajiv Gandhi visit just before that. And I think Vijay captures that objectivity very well in the book. He's very acute on the leaders, on Deng Xiaoping, on Zhao Ziyang, on the others. And of course, as he just said, he's pretty hard on Chinese and Western propaganda. Because the fact is, everybody else looked at this ideologically from wherever they stood. And that, I think, colored their presentation of what happened, of how they presented it. There are some things about Tiananmen which we will never know. The precise number of dead. I think Vijay is right. On the square itself, there was probably no massacre. In fact, the student leaders themselves said later, many of them outside, that they did vacate the square, but there were killings elsewhere. You know, for a week after June 4th, CCTV, Chinese Central Television, was showing really gruesome pictures of PLA soldiers who had been strung up, skinned, burnt alive, all kinds of things to show us how bad it was. But then I think they realized this is counterproductive because it suggests huge popular resentment and an uprising, actually. So suddenly everything vanished. And if Tiananmen were not important, frankly, they wouldn't have to erase the memory. Yes. The mere fact that that memory has been erased tells you how important Tiananmen is. For me, Tiananmen matters in three respects. One is Xi Jinping today can centralize power can actually control the party because of what happened, not just Tiananmen, but the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fright that gave the Chinese ruling elite. It created actually a form of elite unity which was unprecedented in the Communist Party, which was used to tremendous factional fights, and the book brings that out beautifully. But it created the conditions for what we are seeing today. Of course, it also created the conditions for China's masterly manipulation of the West for the next 2 decades to enable the rise of China. Because within weeks, Scowcroft was there, sent by President Bush. Nixon was there in November. And for all the rhetoric and whatever CNN might say and democracy and so on, when push came to shove, the West as a whole chose business over human rights democracy. They might give a Nobel Peace Prize to the Dalai Lama and so on to tweak, to thumb their noses at the Chinese. But the fact is that business was back to normal within 2 years. And that, I think, showed the way forward. But the third reason why Tiananmen matters is because Deng drew the conclusion that the young people didn't know enough about what the Communist Party had done for China and started patriotic education campaigns, got Jiang Zemin to start it. So a lot of this virulent, popular hyper-nationalism that you see today can actually be traced back to that. The Japanese blame a lot of the deterioration in their relationship actually directly to those campaigns because patriotic education needed an enemy. Before that, Mao and Deng used to present Chinese history as the Chinese as heroes, that they had stood up to imperialism, to class enemies, and that they had managed to take their own future into their own hands. After that, suddenly it became a story of victimhood, of a century of humiliation, and that's a very different form of nationalism and that's what we are today dealing with. So Tiananmen for me matters in every which way. We were a beneficiary. We actually got a few years of peace. We got a border peace and tranquility agreement, but I won't go into that because Deng had to deal with his internal issues. He had to deal with the US. Once the Soviets fell, he thought maybe he was the next target for regime change, last big communist regime standing. So we got actually in several years to actually keep the border as it were and to do what we did, which is over. That period is over. So all in all, it's a really useful book. I have one big criticism though. Vijay Gokhale is too modest. I wish there were more Vijay Gokhale in this book because he was easily one of the most active, best informed diplomats in Beijing at that time. And you wouldn't believe it reading the book. I mean, now you realize how good his analytical skills and so on are when you read the book. But maybe, we can prize that out of him later. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. If I can just, that also kind of stands out in the book, Ambassador Gokhale, is that, you write it with a scholar's pen. But I think there are many, especially in the middle of the book, the key central chapters where, we're going through that period from, say, the kind of 2 weeks of May. I don't know, was it a kind of a process within yourself where you took a call and said that you want to put yourself outside of the book? Because that comes across very clearly, is that there's an objectivity almost to a fault, if you like.
Well, I didn't want it to be a memoir in that sense. And so I had to grapple with how much to put in, which I could not substantiate or which might appear as if I was detracting from the larger message of the book. The number of incidents which Mr. Menon is also aware of, incidents like there was a lot of the Western media on the 3rd of June put out a story saying that 2 units of the People's Liberation Army were going to fight each other on the Tiananmen Bridge. Now, Mr. Menon had an apartment which overlooked the Tiananmen Bridge. And I recall very distinctly that some of us were there that day. And for the life of us, we couldn't see any 2 units sort of clashing with each other. But this was the news of the Western media. But then I thought that, that's something which may be difficult to corroborate. So a few personal anecdotes like that were left out by me because I really wanted it to be much more a sort of a more balanced account rather than purely anecdotal.
Thank you, sir. Just one question from Ambassador Menon, and before I turn to Tanvi, is the question for you says, as the DCM when you were there, so Ambassador Gokhale's book makes it very clear that a lot of this was about actors and decision making within China. And the Tiananmen papers, now published in English, what, about 20 years ago, makes that very clear as well. You know, whether you look at the 3 or 4 central actors within the kind of committee that were making these decisions. But I wonder how much of what happened at Tiananmen was a result of those decisions, or was it structure? Was there just a time in China where Deng and the party as a whole came together and said is that there has to be a limitation to political and social stability? So, for instance, you know, if I turn the question around and ask you a counterfactual one, if Zhu Ziyang, for instance, had more prominence in the process at the time, would Tiananmen have turned out to be different?
I don't think Tiananmen would have turned out to be different. I think the factionalism within the leadership, the divisions, actually guaranteed first the paralysis, then the agreement on martial law with the elders, starting with the elders, but then finding factional support in Li Peng and some of the younger leaders, and certainly the whole security apparatus who didn't like what was going on. And so I'm not sure that the course of Tiananmen would have been different. But I do think that there wasn't consensus on what happens next after Tiananmen. And it took him until 1992, until his Southern Progress, to get economic reforms going again. And to say we will open economically, we will run economic reforms based on the market, but we will shut the political system. No bourgeois liberalism, we will 4 principles, etc. I mean, a whole set of things which tightened ideology, started patriotic education, etc. So no glasnost, but we do perestroika. And that, because frankly, these things were coming at the Chinese leadership at a tremendous pace. It wasn't only Tiananmen, the discontent among their own people, and to see cadres, party cadres, People's Daily, journalists out on the street demonstrating. You know, this is a shock to a leadership. And then you see the Soviet Union collapse next to you. So your whole model on which you started, which you might have evolved, now is under attack. And what do? Do you then go back to autarky? Do you close off? There were a lot of people who thought they should. So there were political battles going on after Tiananmen as well. And the final thing, I think it took until 1992 for Deng to actually get his way, but he was a master manipulator of factions. He and Mao, both of them. And they used the factions and the divisions in the leadership to ultimately get their way and make themselves balancers in this. So yes, I think it could have gone in various directions after Tiananmen. But Tiananmen itself, I'm not so sure that I don't know, Vijay would know better.
I agree with you, sir, entirely.
Okay. We're just going to turn to Tanvi. I'm going to come back to some of the questions about India and Tiananmen and the Rajiv Gandhi visit and the reset in the relationship. So I'm going to save that for the last. But you know, Tanvi, I've got some questions, but I also know that you've got 3 comments, 2 questions, and 1 disappointment. So over to you.
Thanks, Rudra. I'd like to start by saying my thoughts are with all of you dealing with the terrible COVID crisis in India. You know, one of the reasons I appreciated Ambassador Gokhale's book is that it was an escape for me as well, transporting me, as Rudy said, to a different time and place. And like all good books, it gets the reader really thinking. So it's good to have things other than kind of the immediate crisis, perhaps, to think about. I was very pleased that Rudy asked me to be on this panel. As a historian, it's a real treat to have a chance to participate in a session with those who've had a ringside seat to the events that I only get to look at from a scholar's perspective. And this book really does cover those critical few months and even sets it within that broader time frame in China, which almost bookended what was a really crucial period between 1989 and 1991, globally as well as for India. And as a side note, that was the period that really sparked my love for history, because I remember it very vividly. And for me, other than World This Week on Doordarshan, it was kind of India's own opening up and the Western media that helped bring that to somebody of my generation, at least, and kind of opened up the world to us. China's style, as Rudy said, I will list 3 strengths, 2 questions, and 1 disappointment related to Ambassador Gokhale's book. First of the three strengths. I think the book describes and analyzing that very important kind of moment in history, but a moment that, as Ambassador Menon said, has had and continues to have significance beyond that moment. It has cast a long shadow. So it will help a reader understand not just the China of the 1980s, but it will also tell us something about, and does tell us something about, the situation today. Beyond kind of the points that Ambassador Menon mentioned, as you think even about evolving major power competition in the present day, there are dimensions you cannot comprehend without going back to that moment at the end of the 80s and the lessons that were learned, and not just learned by the cast of characters that are mentioned in the book itself. For instance, the Communist Party of China's feeling of being besieged, and even the lack of trust vis-a-vis the US that continues to this day. That brings me to the second strength of the book, that it breaks down the black box, or perhaps more appropriately, the red box that is Zhongnanhai, that is the kind of Chinese leadership. The book really does portray leadership that is not monolithic, as sometimes is assessed. And indeed, Ambassador Gokhale argues for a power struggle within it as a crucial factor, if not the crucial factor, in how events between April and June 1989 developed. I think the book is really kind of strong in describing the context for those months through the 80s, the nuances of assessing and interacting with the state and party in China, the personalities involved and the dynamic and friction between them. But it also, I think, makes the point that there was one overarching priority for the Chinese Communist Party above all else, regime preservation, and the party at the top of it. And that meant, and has continued to mean, that domestic imperatives take priority over foreign ones. Even as Mr. Gokhale argues in the book, that over time, the ideology driving the leadership has changed from communism to power and money. The third strength of the book is the writing. It is really a vividly written account. You can, and Rudy said a scholar's writing. I think it also has the strength of a journalist writing almost. And I say that in the best sense of the term. It keeps a pace that is very readable. And you can almost picture the developments in the square and a Longtan Avenue, the Avenue of Eternal Peace, which was the key vantage point. Though I would say for those who have not been to Beijing, it would have been useful for the publishers had included a map of the city. And I think because of how well written it is, I read the book in one sitting, but like all good books, it sent me down a research rabbit hole in search of answers for questions that it raised in my mind. And that brings me to my two questions that I will lay out, and I have many, but I'll highlight two. I think towards kind of the end of the book, Ambassador Gokhale mentions that Deng Xiaoping understood his people. But he also makes the case in the first half of the book that the Communist Party leadership missed or misread the developing situation and unhappiness that led to this protest. So the question is, why did this party miss what was brewing? The second question is related to Ambassador Gokhale's assessment of the US posture. One of the things that does come out, that if you kind of look at the broader literature, is that unlike what the Western media, or perhaps even diplomats in the American embassy had been saying in Washington, particularly in the White House, the president, George H.W. Bush at the time, actually comes down on the side of Ambassador Gokhale. He saw this as a power struggle. But as Ambassador Gokhale noted, interests, whether that was balance of power and profit, trumped values for the US in terms of the administration's response. This was also true for India's posture, trying to preserve kind of the benefits of that 1988 visit and take advantage of the situation to some extent. And so the question I have is, for Ambassador Gokhale, is if you and senior leadership in Washington or Delhi, were there things in hindsight, when you look back, were there things that you would have done differently, and not just vis-a-vis the Tiananmen incident, but the US and Indian approaches to China in the 1980s and 1990s, knowing what we know now? And finally, the last point, this last question is related to my one disappointment with the book, which has already been alluded to, but which I hope will be addressed maybe here by Ambassador Menon and Gokhale. or in their future memoirs, whenever they write those, which is that I would have really liked to see more in the book on their own views, but also on the Indian government's perceptions of the events and what the debates were, where the assessments were different from, say, the US view, or the British view, or the European view. You see glimpses of it in the book, such as in the discussion at the debate in the embassy on how to respond to an incident of Chinese soldiers firing in the diplomatic area, and then Delhi's reaction and even unhappiness to the development, to the decision that the ambassador made. So I would like to see much more of that, but that's a good sign of a good book where you want more rather than say, you know, why did I spend my day reading this? So congratulations to Ambassador Gokhale for what is really a must read.
Thanks, Tanvi. If I could perhaps just take the Tanvi's question to Ambassador Gokhale. You know, a lot of the book covers the Deng's kind of position on Huyabang and that entire kind of conversation, and you know, his discomfort, and then you show almost, you know, at a 2-foot level how that kind of discomfort kind of progresses. But did the Chinese leadership in around 1987, 1988, did they misread the power of the street by trying to focus very much on the power of the opposing leadership? So, you know, to Tanvi's question, for instance, did they themselves perhaps misread what was happening in the time?
Yeah, thank you, Tanvi. Thank you. Those are very useful insights. I think they misread both, to some extent, the situation on the street, but I think they also misread the situation within the party. Because it wasn't just Huyabang. There was a group of people within the party who felt that some form of political liberalization, or at least a relaxation, should go along with the economic reform. And essentially, they were so caught up in finding a replacement to Huyabang that they presumed that with the removal of Huyabang, that problem had been addressed. But of course, it hadn't, because the factionalism within the party hadn't yet been resolved. And it manifested itself in 1989. So in that sense, I think perhaps what was happening inside the party was more important than, or a misreading of what was happening inside the party was perhaps should be given greater weightage than what was happening on the street. But this is a question that Mr. Menon could throw light on, because he was actually there during the fall of Huyabang. I joined the embassy just after that. So maybe Mr. Menon could shed some light.
The immediate trigger for Huyabang's fall was student demonstrations, big character posters in Peking University and so on. I mean, that was what was presented. And he was removed from his post, but not from the party. And he was sort of eased out, and the leadership thought they'd handled the problem, as Vijay said. But the fact was, there was actually a much longer list of accusations against him, including being soft on the Tibetans, because he had made various offers to the Dalai Lama, being soft on Japan, and being soft on us. We were also in that list of 8 things which he was supposed to have done wrong. But I think the problem was that at that stage, the elders were feeling increasingly sidelined by Huyabang and the younger leaders who were coming in. And that got transferred to Chaudhry, to Huyabang's successor. Because the elders thought, we've made this revolution. We're the ones who brought us back from the Cultural Revolution. We've made this possible. And we therefore should have the decisive say. And it's an interesting phenomenon how Deng used the elders during Tiananmen to get his way. But having done that, used Tiananmen to put them on the shelf, to put them on the mantelpiece, as it were, and to disband the Council of Elders and their advice. So actually, this is why I think Vijay's account of inner party politics is so important and so fascinating, because frankly, this level of detail is very rare. It's very rare that you find a book which actually ties policy to personalities, to factions, to the issues that face them at the moment. And Tiananmen is really a great choice. because it's a one moment when you have a level of transparency. I think Vijay says somewhere in the book that, we could talk to anybody. Now, for anybody who's been in China since 1949 to be able to make that statement, it's a wonderful statement. It's like liberation. And so that's really why I think there's great strength in this book, and it's well worth reading.
I'm going to come back to Tanvi's second question to the both of you on the question of realpolitik, because Ambassador Gokhale, you do make that point in the book to say that, look, this was just realpolitik. The Bush administration sort of coming in and basically coming to some kind of an agreement to say is that, look, as long as you stick to your script, we stick to ours, you don't interfere, we can get on. It reminds me of Kissinger meeting TN Call in 1972 in Washington and basically saying, look, we backed the wrong horse in 71. And it'll be interesting to get a sense of what the embassy was thinking. If I'm not mistaken, S.K. Singh would have been the foreign secretary at the time, and some of the correspondences. But I'm going to be a bit unfair to Tanvi and first turn on the scholar, which is to say is that you've studied this fateful triangle. Your entire thesis, although it doesn't come post sort of 79, but you've looked at how India's relations with the United States has been shaped by China. How do you read that, the Tiananmen moment? I mean, through the lens of the fateful triangle, if I had to kind of extrapolate your thesis by a decade, how would you see this?
So you'll be glad to know, Rudy, that's what the next book is on, which is also why it's nice because I will be sending emails at some point to both the ambassadors or the former ambassadors here to interview them on the 80s, but and post the 80s. But I think, one of the things is that having written a book called Fateful Triangle, this really has to be understood as a pentagon at the very least. Because the other two actors, or not actors, but countries involved was the Soviet Union and Pakistan. And you really do see, and I think this is where the book also situates the moment and what was happening with Sino-Soviet relations at the time. And the kind of historic rapprochement that the Deng Xiaoping was trying to undertake there. India was, of course, worried about that Sino-Soviet rapprochement for what it meant for Indian space. And so that had been accompanied by India kind of stabilizing relations, improving relations with the US. And of course, all this is going on while the 80s was probably the peak due to the situation in Afghanistan, where the US, China, and Pakistan were ranged kind of, to, so to speak, at least against the Soviets, but in a way that was harmful to Indian interests, with the US at the very at best looking the other way, while China was helping Pakistan out in terms of especially its nuclear program, but also building military capability. At worst, it was actually kind of creating the space for it. So you do see kind of how much this is so interconnected. But as Ambassador Menon said, it was also India making India's decisions were also based on realpolitik, which is to preserve kind of that moment that started with Rajiv Gandhi's visit in 1988, but then also taking advantage of China then looking for moments, which arguably Indian governments have done at multiple points since. So even kind of if you look at the 2017, 2018 moment about the window of opportunity to stabilize China-India relations, arguably that came about because the US was pressing, China felt pressed by the US, particularly the Trump administration. That fall, in particular, that summer and fall is when the Trump administration turns on China, so to speak. And you saw Beijing reaching out to both Japan and India, to some extent Australia, but to again create space. So I think this is all interlocked in a way that, if you want to take even the longer shadow, without that moment in the 80s and 90s, which now, at least in the US, you've had people like Kurt Campbell, who's now Indo-Pacific coordinator at the National Security Council, Eli Ratner of a younger generation, but nominated to be Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Indo-Pacific, write about things that went wrong. Like, should we have done differently, even if not in action, in expectations for what China would be? So I do think, and now that the moment has changed, China is seen more competitively, that has redounded to India's benefit. Because not just the US, but many countries see India as important and useful, and therefore they become more useful and important to India as India deals with China. So I think it's all very connected, and you'll see this in the book in terms of how the various strands are connected.
Thanks, Tanvi. And I'm going to just turn to we've got a range of audience questions, which I'll come to in a second. If I just turn to Ambassador Gokhale and also Ambassador Menon, and put you into the kind of put your feet back into those times. Here, I mean, the 80s was an incredible time. I think you had the last vista of the packet settlement in 82. In 86, we had the kind of the intervention on the border. You had Somdarongchu. You had the claim on Tawang. And then you've got these big geopolitical changes that Tanvi talks about. The Gorbachev visit, the Rajiv Gandhi visit, of course, before that, and then the Bush administration's kind of continued detente with China. So can you just give us a sense? There's all this going on in if I can take you back to May and June of 89. There's all this going out on the streets. You've got a view of the street which is somewhat different to most other accounts. But then there's all this other happening geopolitically. You're at a kind of a cusp of beginning a new era with China, which in many senses, the way you did it is perhaps also to have a kind of a blinkered realpolitik appreciation of the time. Is, as I think it was Ambassador Menon in his new book who's written, is that it was perhaps pushed the Chinese to be even more accommodative at that particular point of time. And clearly that was recognized in the embassy. So can you just give us a sense of how did you kind of put this jigsaw together in 89?
No, I think the real question facing us in the embassy was what actions we took and what the impact would be on India-China relations. Rajiv Gandhi's visit was certainly a turning point in that relationship, and it had come with a lot of hard work on both sides. Now, a number of decisions had been taken, including the setting up of the joint working group to settle the boundary question, which had yet to meet. And within 3 or 4 months of Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi returning back to New Delhi, this problem had arisen. So from Delhi's perspective, the interest was firstly in determining whether the political dispensation with whom Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi had parleyed in December 1988 still held. And secondly, whether Indian actions in response to the student protests would endanger that. Now, of course, in the embassy, and I was a relatively junior officer, I was not privy to a lot of the policy decisions in Delhi, but the one window that I got into this was the whole question of how we would respond after the shooting incident on the diplomatic compounds, where the Western embassies entirely withdrew their staff. But it became a dilemma as to whether we should or not. Clearly, on security considerations, this was warranted because one of our apartments, an apartment in which one of our diplomats lived, had been hit by a bullet. On the other hand, optically withdrawing the embassy entirely or most of it might complicate efforts by New Delhi to keep that relationship going forward. So it was an extremely difficult decision for the ambassador and for the deputy chief of mission, who were the two people responsible. We were just onlookers. It's now easy in hindsight to make judgments, but at the time when you didn't have mobile phones, you didn't have the internet, making a trunk call, I mean, those days there were the lightning calls and various other names, and the lightning call also used to take 10 hours to materialize. You had to take a decision on the spot, and that's what the embassy had to do. So it was a tough choice, but I would broadly say that we managed to navigate through that as well. And really, we went on to have the boundary discussions in August or September, and the relationship continued as normal, except, of course, that the Congress party lost that election. And so some amount of the momentum was lost after 1989.
If I just turn to Ambassador Menon very quickly, sir, you were privy to those policy discussions. You were the number 2 at the embassy, for instance. So can you kind of just make sense of those fast changing geopolitical times and your appreciation of it at the time?
But let me take a step back. Tanvi said quite rightly, all this was connected. But we had very poor visibility. It's not like we knew exactly what was going on. Yes. We didn't know the list of 8 charges against Huyabang when Gorbachev made his speech in Vladivostok signaling an opening to China. But fortunately, we had a healthy tradition of internal debate among ourselves. I say fortunately, Because, and I'll take you back to Gorbachev's Vladivostok speech in '86, for instance. We in Beijing immediately saw it as the Soviets are going to open to the Chinese. We need to respond to this, etc., etc. The embassy in Moscow thought this is rubbish. And finally, because we kept arguing, I was told quite clearly in writing that this is well above your pay grade. You don't understand this, young man, by somebody in Moscow, somebody very senior in Moscow. But it's fine. That didn't matter. Frankly, we have this tradition where we argue. We always had a running dialogue with East Asia Division in Delhi about what's happening in the Chinese leadership, what's happening in internal politics, what does it mean for us? We didn't always get it right, but at least by arguing, we ended up, I think, on the right track. And we also, maybe we were manipulative, but I think this is where we were actually better than the Americans in dealing with the consequences of Tiananmen. The Americans threw away a lever by sending Scowcroft. They had a lever there which they could have used to shape the relationship with China going forward. But by taking the pressure off and signaling quite clearly, and that I assume was not a realpolitik decision. I assume that was President Bush out of his own experience, his inclination, and which for me suggests that personalities matter. In Rajiv Gandhi's case, he was determined to preserve the legacy of his visit. I know that he said later when he was out of power once, that, you know, maybe we shouldn't have evacuated the families. And he was then, somebody then told him, what if one of them had been killed?
Yes.
And he stopped for a minute and he said, yeah, maybe I was wrong. I mean, he had the decency to say that. But all I'm trying to say here is that, you know, when it comes to Tanvi's book, I think we'll see a lot of these. But there were different points of view within the government of India, but we had a tradition of arguing these things out openly among ourselves. It was a tradition within the embassy. I mean, I think we all felt we could speak and that everybody's views had value. And it was a tradition between us and the ministry and with other missions who we used to bring into this dialogue. And it's really useful. And I do hope it goes on. Because, as I said, you don't have 100% visibility. The rearview mirror is much clearer than your windshield. And this is a real problem all the time. So we're groping. But I think we did go through Sundarang-Chu, through the Soviet opening to China, through shifting US policy at the end of the Cold War. And then finally, actually, the US taking their eye off and concentrating on creating a new world order in Europe. So I think we did manage to navigate that fairly well. And then with our big changes at home, when Narasimha Rao came, and economic reform, our opening to Taiwan, etc. All of which Vijay was a big part of, by the way. And, so we need Tanvi's book.
This can go on for quite some time, but I'm also keeping an eye on the clock and the questions. If I can take this question to you, Ambassador Gokhale, it's a pretty powerful one. It says, this is from Sakshi. She says, do you see another Tiananmen Square incident in the coming years in China? And if I can take another aspect to that question is, are we reading the Chinese leadership right today? So, you know, you talked about how in the late 1980s, Ambassador Menon talked about the power of argument within government. You talked about a structure within the embassy where you had a minister consular who had spent time, who knew China. You had people who knew China. So to take Sakshi's argument even further, are you sanguine with the way in which the establishment in India or more generally are reading the Chinese leadership today?
Well, you know, predicting anything in China is a difficult job. You know, if I could have done it, I might make as much money as Henry Kissinger. But I'd certainly say that I think broadly the Indian official establishment has got a fairly good understanding of developments in China. It's not necessarily the case that we get everything right, but the general sense that we have got of the Deng Xiaoping period, of the post-Deng Xiaoping period, and even of the current government, way before many others had come to the conclusion that President Xi Jinping had consolidated his position. I think many people who follow China in India, both within the government and outside it, had already come to that conclusion. So I would say we have a fairly good assessment of the situation inside China. But where I think we are lacking is there are not enough writings by Indians on Chinese politics, and perhaps not enough interest by the average Indian, the ordinary Indian citizen about China. And that needs to change, because this is 1.4 billion Chinese living next to 1.4 billion Indians. And if we go by any prediction in the world today, it is that both countries will enhance their status in the world. We can discuss how much of it will be enhanced and how much of it we will be able to do. But we are in a different position from the West. It's not a zero-sum game between us and China. China is rising, we are also rising. So we're obviously taking somebody else's share of the cake. Therefore, to look at it from the Western perspective, because their share of the cake is going to decline, would not be the best way to do it. So I think what we have a fairly good understanding, I would say, within the government and strategic community, but we need to enhance understanding within Indian public opinion and the larger, population of the country.
If I can just turn that same question, we've got a couple of questions on understanding China. If I can turn that to Tanvi, sitting in DC, for instance, and someone who kind of works in this area and has long worked in this area, if I just read Ambassador Gokhale's book, it provides a pretty low bar view of Western appreciation of China. Has that changed dramatically today? You mentioned some of the key figures in the current administration, but do you think the understanding of the leadership China, or is there a power of ideology, much like in the 1980s, that is also shaping the way in which China is understood today?
So I think even then, if you look back at some of the papers that have come out, and so not just kind of hindsight memoirs that have come out from American officials, there was a debate, very much so, and along the lines, is this, James Lilly, the American ambassador, might have been arguing from his kind of point of view that this was, a plea for Western democracy. But you had a lot of people, and you saw a lot of this come out in the 30th anniversary in 2019, but this idea that no, it was a combination of demands from the public that was unhappy about kind of the economic situation, corruption, issues like that. But as Ambassador Gokhale's book pointed out, they might not, even if he says that it wasn't a democratic revolution, they clearly were, from their posters, from what they were asking for, did want certain freedoms, or more freedom at least. And so you did have that debate even in the US at the time. And I think one thing that you've seen is here the problem isn't knowledge about China. I would say it's kind of, you need more people doing India. They're in fact very good in fact developments in terms of people studying domestic politics on India here. But on the China front, I think partly because of the commercial interest, you saw a lot of, over the course of the 80s, 90s, 2000s, even today, you saw a lot of kind of money going in to investing in the understanding of China. Now you can say, well, people still got it wrong, but sometimes you're not listening to people who are telling you what the situation is, but what you'd like it to be. That's a different situation. I will say, I think one thing about the book is if Chinese politics was made as interesting as it is in Ambassador Gokhale's book to the Indian public, which loves like even figuring out what's happening in American politics or British politics, you'd find, I think, also more kind of regular interest in it if it was covered in the same way. It's often kind of, especially in the media, not portrayed as, it's China does this. And so I think those debates are crucial. It was what I found interesting, even about the 70s. I've talked to Ambassador Menon about this, which is the fascinating debates I never knew existed were in MEA between sometimes the Soviet hands and the China hands. It wasn't between the US and Soviet hands in the 70s. And so, those are the kind of things I think you can make a lot more interesting. But I think in the US, you've seen an investment in China studies, think tanks at universities in a way that is quite comprehensive. And importantly, and that's a lesson for those thinking about how to expand India studies in the US, it is not just looking at culture. It is looking at history, it is looking at politics, it is looking at economics, it's looking at foreign policy as well. So it can't just be let's go back and look at one aspect. It has to be more well-rounded to really understand the dynamics. One pity is going to be, I think, as people get less of a chance to travel to China, it is becoming more closed in many ways. And even if you can go there, sometimes people are not as frank. And this is where India is different. And frankly, a much better place to study in some ways, because you can actually go and understand and have conversations, which I fear a little bit we're going to lose in terms of thinking about China from the US perspective.
Thanks, Tanvi. And we're coming to the end of the hour. We just passed the hour, but there's a question from Ambassador Suresh Goyal, who was there in 1989. I should say there's also a comment by Ambassador Kishan Rana, who agrees with you, sir, completely on the position of Alan Donald. I think he knew him as first secretary in the 1960s. But Ambassador Goyal asked a question of, can we ever expect political liberalization in China? And let me kind of contextualize that question from your own book. Is a lot of the 80s and a lot of your book is about putting limitations to bourgeois liberalization in the late 1980s in different forms, changing characters, changing leaders, and then finally kind of cracking down. Has the effects of Tiananmen in some way, or the amnesic effects of Tiananmen, cut short any potential of what you may call another bourgeois liberalization or a more ground-up liberalization process in China? So I'm going to ask you unfairly to be Henry Kissinger, and then I'm going to turn to Ambassador Menon as well. But do you see political liberalization in China?
Yeah, so Rudra, my view is that after 1990, the Chinese state gave the people what they wanted, which was real growth in incomes, jobs, and so on for 30 years on the trot. And I think the people sacrificed some of their expectations because they were enjoying the good life. I think there was a blip on the radar last year when COVID happened. And at least there were reports of some rumblings within. But the manner in which the Chinese state has dealt with the COVID situation post-May last year, the way they brought stability, they've eradicated the infection, they've brought the economy back to speed. I think that if they can maintain this situation going ahead, the chances of something like Tiananmen happening again, at least in this decade, may be small. On the other hand, however, my own sense also is that normally this excessive tightening of control or grip happens if there is an inner fear. I mean, instinctively, you don't grip onto something unless you think somebody is going to take it away from you. So the question is, when does that grip become so tight that or when does the rubber band become so tight that it snaps? That's something that I just can't predict. But I would certainly say that if I were Chinese today and I see my country's global position improving annually and my own well-being improving annually, then I would be less inclined to question if a few freedoms were not given to me. At least that's the way I would see it if I were Chinese.
Ambassador Menon?
I agree with Vijay. Actually, China spends more on internal security than she does on national defense, which gives you some idea of what they worry about and what concerns them. So is another Tiananmen possible? Unlikely with this kind of very heavy security state and surveillance state which has been constructed. Is liberalization possible? Only with Chinese characteristics, one. Two, if the Communist Party of China feels liberalization is in its interest. There have been periods in the past of relative openness for intellectuals, for argument, and so on. And that's one way for it to come. But it's not going to be westernization or democracy in the way in which it is now defined outside China. And increasingly, I think there is a turning in China among intellectuals who are not necessarily beholden to the party, to their own past, to their imperial past, to Confucianism, so, which is why I say, if there is going to be an opening, a relaxation internally, some political reform, it's going to be very Chinese. It's going to be very different from anything that
Yes.
anybody else expects. And but I don't rule it out because frankly, change in China, political change in China has always been discontinuous and has always surprised everybody.
Yes.
So, and for most of its history, China has not been a tight, organized Westphalian state. For all the theory that centralized imperial systems and so on, it hasn't been, and it has never acted as a Westphalian state in the past. This is in a sense, this is an aberration, what we've had since the founding of the PRC. So let's see what happens. But I think it's very hard to predict. So I agree entirely with what Vijay said.
And let's just hope that when that moment of change comes, that power of argument that all of you have so eloquently put out and Ambassador Gokhale has penned so well in his book remains, so that we are as able to read the street as we are the political establishment when and if that point in itself comes. Ambassador Gokhale, thank you so much. All I can say is I hope very much that you're not going to do this kind of decade by decade, because I think there are a number of a lot of people in the audience who are hoping that you can skip straight into the 21st century. But I have to say is that as a reader, this is a fantastic format, and we very much look forward to the next book. Ambassador Menon, we're looking forward to having you with us in June for a deep discussion on your new book. And Tanvi, let's put a date in 2022. We're looking forward to inviting you for your book launch here at Carnegie India. But with that, Ambassador Gokhale, Ambassador Menon, Tanvi Madan, thank you so much for spending the hour with us on India and the world. And for the audience, thank you so much for bearing with us, staying with us. Please stay as well as you can. Please stay as safe as you can. And we'll have you back for another edition of India and the World in June in a couple of weeks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Rudra. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Tanvi.
Thank you. Thanks, Vijay, for giving us this opportunity. It really is a wonderful read. I'm so glad
Thank you, sir.